Hi, Andrew from SACS, and welcome to video number 6 in our series on candidate attraction and candidate evaluation. In the candidate attraction section, we covered a range of things about how to attract candidates in tough times. So far in the candidate evaluation section, talked about the various accuracy of different recruitment techniques, and we explained a thing called Biodata scoring in video number 5. In this one, we're going to be talking about behavioural interviewing. Behavioural interviewing is the most accurate form of interviewing that's ever been discovered from a research point of view, and there are some really practical things that you can do to make your behavioural interviewing process as accurate as possible. In video number 1 of this series, we talked about a thing called outcome-based job definition, where you define a job by the outcomes that achieve rather than the tasks that are necessary to be undertaken to complete the job. So outcome-based job definition is a rapidly growing approach to job definition, and it's taking over from the traditional method of job definition, which is called task-based job definition. Now, good outcome-based job definition identifies the outcomes of the job. So how is the world a better place when this job is done well? And you'll see we're using the terminology RWOs here. That stands for real world outcomes. And so if you've undertaken a job definition process and you've discovered happy clients and managed within a budget, they're two measurable outcomes for a job. By the way, one of the things that we see in a lot of jobs, HR jobs, never in the job definition is happy customers mentioned. What is it that an HR manager is for? Well, you interact with a range of stakeholders across the organisation and they have to be satisfied with what they get. So that's the idea of outcome-based job definition. It causes people to assess things that otherwise might be ignored when you look at a list of tasks. The best way of writing behavioural interview questions is these simple 4 letters, PGAE. Please give it an example. Look, the essence of behavioural interviewing is that questions about the past turn out to be vastly more accurate than questions about the future. Questions about concrete things turn out to be vastly more accurate than questions about abstract things. So questions about what would you do in this scenario can identify good interviewees in the sense of people who can be glib in answering such questions, but the glib answer doesn't mean they can actually do it. A behavioural interview is a process of sharing experience to cause the person to come up with their best example of where they've done something similar in the past. Now, interviews, as I showed you in previous videos, are really questionable from an accuracy point of view, and people love to rely extremely heavily on them. There's a form of bias that's been identified in psychology called the narrative bias. And the narrative bias is where you kind of make up a story about a person and you believe it deeply. So people's capacity to believe stories about candidates can be unwound by saying, give us an example of where you've done something similar in the past. And if they can answer that, even if they're not a fantastically glib and well-presented candidate, that will give them an opportunity to show their wares. On the other hand, if a person is glib and is polished, but can't give you specific examples of where they've done these things in the past, once more, you're being not taken in by the image, by the gloss. You're getting to the crux of whether they're likely to be able to do this job or not. PGAE, please give an example of when you made clients happy. Please give an example of when you managed within a budget. Now you notice that these are worded very simply. Research once more suggests the simpler you make questions, the more likely you get to the truth. You can end up with a behavioural interview question which is something like, please give an example of when you made clients happy. What was the situation? What was the outcome? And how did you measure your success? Well, put all that stuff in if you want, but it gives you an opportunity to say, please give an example of where you made clients happy. That's a simple question, easy to understand, will draw the best response out of the candidate. And then when the person has answered that question, if you want to dig in a little bit more detail, okay, how did you know that was successful? You can use that as follow-up questions. Simplicity makes for good interviewing. Now, these are way more predictive than tell us about yourself or what would you do in the following situation type questioning, because the best predictor of the future is the past. This is a really important point here. Interviews, particularly panel interviews, are an institutional method for discriminating against introverts. Take your average really smart introvert and put them in front of 4 pairs of prying eyes, boring into them while they're trying to think of their best answers. Well, that's just not an introverty kind of a thing. And in fact, often introverts go home, and we've had this in our business where people will call us and say, oh, I thought of a much better example once I had a chance to relax and think about it. I actually suggest that you send the behavioural interview questions to the candidates before you interview them. Why not? Why rely on only the examples they can come up with in front of you? Why not give them the opportunity to see the questions that you want to ask and to come up with their answers, to identify their best example? If they give you something that's not their best example, is that a bad thing? If they're in front of you and they're stressed, is that necessarily a bad thing? It means that they may not be great at interviews, but we all know people who are outstanding employees who are bad at interviews. You've got to demystify the interview. You've got to take the sting out of the interview and make it more like a normal human interaction. So why not tell them about the questions that you want them to answer? Now, if they make it up, and very, very, very few people do this, but if they make up their answers, then your follow-up question, who did you have to speak to get authority from this? What was the final outcome? What was the budget? Those kinds of questions. We'll find that out, because if they can't answer those questions, well, clearly that's not a genuine answer. So interviews should be designed to find out about the past. The best predictor of the future is the past. I suggest demystify the interview, give them an opportunity to reflect on the questions beforehand. I think if you adopt this process, you may well find that the interviews are better, more accurate and more satisfying. In an earlier video, I was very unkind about the idea of key selection criteria. Said it was very old-fashioned and backward and there are better ways of doing it. I suggest read the people's CVs, and the ones whose CVs are approximately close to what you're looking for, what you can then do is get in touch with them and say, would you mind answering these behavioural interview questions? So they can become your key selection criteria. The reason I mentioned this is that I've helped many organisations which have, as a matter of policy, that you have to have key selection criteria. If you then send the behavioural interview questions which are targeted, they're not vague things like address a certain point or something like that. It's much more specifically, please give an example of where you have managed staff in multiple locations, let's say. That can draw out a better response from the candidates, and it can be worthwhile, especially if they understand, hey, your CV looks good, we're considering you seriously, please go to the extra effort of writing this thing. Making the interviews as comfortable as possible. Some people think, well, it's an executive job and an executive job should have stress on it. Well, the problem is that the stress of an interview is almost entirely unrelated to the stress of doing the job. I don't know if anybody's ever thought of being a stand-up comedian, but I think that would be a terrifying thing to do, personally. I don't mind public speaking, but that kind of stuff, you're kind of putting yourself right out there, aren't you? You've written this stuff and you're hoping that people will laugh and those kinds of things. I think an interview is somewhat similar to that. People can't get away from the concept that I am being personally evaluated. And of course, what you want to do is you want to evaluate the person's background. What you're looking for is you're trying to understand their competencies, not their soul. So I think making the interview a partnership and making it as equal as possible and as comfortable as possible, you get away from this stress interview effect. Stress interviews tend not to be accurate in predicting work performance because the stress of an interview is just so different from the stress of doing the job. Get the panel to agree what constitutes a good answer before they start interviewing. I mentioned in the previous video about evaluating CVs that getting agreement from the panel is absolutely crucial as to what we're looking for in a good CV. But even more so, in a sense, is when the people get in front of you and you're interviewing them to agree what a good answer would be. Now, let me tell you a little bit about a thing called psychometrics. Psychometrics is measurement of psychological characteristics. So when people make a judgment about a candidate's capability to do a job, that is a psychometric measure that they're coming up with. And if you've got 4 people on a panel, if people disagree with each other, that's what's known as internal unreliability in the method. So when people are not agreeing with each other, that makes the method unreliable. Now, an unreliable method mathematically must be an invalid method. You can't possibly be accurate in terms of predicting real-world outcomes if the method disagrees with itself. Imagine if you had 3 clocks around you and they all set a different time. Well, obviously, it's unreliable. You can't rely on any of those clocks until you know, okay, this is the valid one. It's the same of when a panel doesn't agree with each other. So, a couple of things. One, make sure that you've got the right people on the panel, people who have a vested interest in getting a good hire. But second, it means you have to invest some time before the panel in deciding what a good CV looks like, deciding what questions you're going to ask, these simple behavioural interview questions, and thirdly, what would constitute a good answer. Now, if you do that, you're going to get inter-rater reliability. In other words, the raters are the people on the panel and they will agree with each other more, and that's going to mean a much more accurate interview process. Now, from there, it's as simple as coming up with a simple scoring system. And we mentioned earlier in this series of videos A, B, C. A means a really strong candidate, B means maybe, C means definitely not. That can be enough to rate candidates. I mean, quite often people come up with all these complicated scoring systems where you'll have competency scores. All the research evidence suggests that those are very, very hard to do accurately. One rating, which is how good is this candidate, can be enough. And in fact, it can be way more accurate than, say, 5 ratings. The concept is, as long as everybody's on the same page about what makes that one rating. A means hireable, B means maybe, C means definitely not, let's say. Or you could rate it out of 10, where 10 means fantastic and 0 means as bad as possible, those kinds of things. Simple is better. So there are some ideas about behavioural interviewing. Now we're going to address in the next video the concept of reference checking. I mentioned in earlier videos that reference checks are pretty inaccurate. The absolute best reference checks get a little ahead of 7% accuracy, and psych tests alone will give you 25, 30% accuracy. So we should not rely too heavily on reference checks, and if you get poor psych results and a great reference check, I certainly know I'd be believing the psych results before the reference check, but still they're worth doing. They can yield important information. The next video will explain to you exactly how to get the best possible value out of your reference checking.